Okay, let's do this. Americans love a spectacle. Now, there are plenty of other people around the world that also love a spectacle, but Americans especially love what is big, bright, and flashy. So, are we routinely presented with a spectacle that triggers an involuntary suspension of disbelief response? And another question we should ask ourselves is, when we get wrapped up in the spectacle, what are the questions that we don't ask? Okay, so follow me here because I think I'm onto something, and I am admittedly speculating a bit here. I am speculating on the spectacular, if you will. But follow along, and I'll be curious to see if you guys agree with kind of what I am presenting here. So, what exactly is a spectacle? I mean, obviously, we use that word a bit, but what exactly do we mean? Well, let's look at just a very simple definition. And let me go ahead and say, I kind of apologize. I know it's kind of dark in here. I don't have the best lighting situation in here, and my camera situation is also not necessarily the best because my external webcam stopped working. So I'm actually using just the internal cam of the computer, and it's not quite as good. But anyway, so what do we mean by a spectacle? So if you just find just a pretty common definition, and I'm just going to definition.com, looking it up, and it says, the noun spectacle. The first definition is a public display or performance, especially a showy or ceremonial one. Okay, so again, that's public display or performance, especially a showy or ceremonial one. The second definition is a thing or person seen, especially an unusual or ridiculous one. A third definition is a strange or interesting object or phenomenon. The fourth definition is like spectacle, as in spectacles, like my spectacles here. That's not really what we're talking about, though. What we're talking about is an event that is this public display or performance, something that is flashy, that is showy, kind of like the most common definition that is presented here, the first one, a public display or performance, especially a showy or ceremonial one. Okay. Um, but what but what do we mean when we say spectacle? Like, what am I getting at? What do I mean when I ask the question, can we get wrapped up in the spectacle? And what do I mean when I say, can being presented with a spectacle trigger an involuntary suspension of disbelief response? All right, let's think about for a moment the way in which there's this psychological need for showmanship. Maybe for those that are the ones presenting the show, or those that feel the need to attend such a show or such a display. So think about your movies, your concerts, your sporting events, video games. I suppose I wouldn't know because I'm not 10 and I'm not a freaking loser. So I have not played video games in like decades and decades, but I know that's a thing. So how have these become more spectacular over time? I mean, just think about the way in which movies have become just more flashy, louder, just bigger in a sense, brighter, flashier. The way in which they have to grab your attention and keep your attention, particularly if we're talking about action movies. Just look at the way in which action movies have evolved over the last couple of decades, right? Now think about sports and entertainment, or news and entertainment, or even politics and entertainment. There seems to be this theatrical aspect even to politics. So I don't have some problem with entertainment. Entertainment is fine. It's perfectly fine to enjoy yourself. It's perfectly fine to engage in entertainment. Depending on what the entertainment is, but entertainment itself is not the problem. The problem is when the lines are blurred such that it's difficult to know where the other item ends and entertainment begins. In other words, like, for example, sports, and I have no problem with sports. I played sports all growing up. I occasionally go to sporting events. I was voted male senior athlete of the year, when I was in high school. Yeah. So, I mean, I have no problem with sports. I have no problem with athletics. I think they're very valuable. Many people have called out professional sports for being, kind of entertainment first. Some people even call out the integrity of certain sporting events. And I'm kind of right there as well. I also think that sporting events are also used as platforms to showcase certain messaging, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. But beyond just, specific messages and themes, there is just the spectacle itself. Okay, so sports and entertainment, and there can be kind of overlap between the two. News and entertainment. Well, this one's particularly dangerous because, again, where does the news end and the entertainment begin? And if those lines are sufficiently blurred, then it's hard to make the distinction. And it's hard to know, okay, what is merely informative and what is performative, if you catch my drift there, right? So let me read a post that I made very recently kind of about this phenomenon in the way that I see it. Okay, so because we're going to talk about the relationship between spectacle and worldview warfare. And then also what I mentioned is this idea of the suspension of disbelief. Okay, so here's the next post that I wrote a while back. And I actually wrote this in January, so a couple months ago. A key part of an op is to create a spectacle, a grand show. For most people, what's important is the performance. They're less interested in what's true or real. This is why and how the theatrics on the world stage captivate and manipulate so many good people. Americans want a show. Most won't admit it to themselves, but what they really care about is a flashy production. If they're presented with a big story, they'll get behind it without thinking so much about what is true, lawful, moral, or even real. To capture most people's minds, all you need is grand showmanship, crafty stage management, and a captivating narrative. Now, I posted that to X on January 5th, 2026. So kind of in the wake of this raid that had happened in Venezuela and the showmanship around that, this spectacle. So that's kind of what was on my mind. That is the occasion that drove the post. But it's not just that. It's not just this raid in Caracas. It's more than that, because we've seen this at hand in plenty of other events as well. Now, more recently, we have had this UFC event on the White House lawn. That was a huge spectacle. And again, I have followed the UFC for a long, long time. I've been a fan of MMA for decades. I even attended a UFC event, years ago. So I'm not saying the UFC is bad. I'm saying that the spectacle around it, that it was presented to be showy and flashy, this grand spectacle. It's not that I have a problem with sports or even with MMA in general. I mean, I don't. I mean, I've never participated in MMA events, but at various times in my life, I mean, I grew up wrestling. I've trained a little bit in boxing. I've trained a little bit in jiu-jitsu. I've even competed in, local events, in jiu-jitsu. I competed in events in the Army. So I have no issue with any of that, with the sports or even the entertainment that sports bring, as long as the integrity of the sport is maintained. So it's not that. It's, again, the spectacle. And that's just one example, the UFC event on the White House lawn. But think about the way in which this idea of the alien disclosure has been kind of floated out there, or the way in which we've been teased over the last few years about the whole, Epstein operation, the Epstein network, etc. I've been saying for years now that the whole Epstein thing, that's a lightning rod, right? In any case, but think about I already mentioned the Venezuela raid, but think about the on again, off again nature of like what's happening with Iran over the last couple of months. The Strait of Hormuz, is it open? Is it closed? Are we at war? Or is there going to be a deal? Or is the deal this, according to what the White House says? Or is the deal this, according to what Iran supposedly says? And then there's a third narrative coming from Israel, and I just assume that everyone's lying. But again, there is a spectacle related to that. Now think about how it's becoming harder to understand what is true, what is real. People are becoming overly concerned about even what they see because of the nature of deep fakes, or the fear mongering around AI, and is it going to become sentient, and exactly how advanced is it? What are its capabilities, etc. Right? Think about violence and spectacle. Think about the historical idea of just public executions. Now, you may be pro or anti-death penalty. That's not my point. I'm just talking about the spectacle or the impact that the spectacle of violence can have. A really good example would be the atomic bombs. Now, I know some people question the historical narrative that we've been told about the use of the atomic bombs. That's not my point here, but just think about the impact that the imagery of the mushroom clouds have. Think about just war footage in general, particularly as we now enter an age in which there's just more footage that is available. Though a lot of people ask, is this footage real? Now, a couple of years ago, there was a term that was floated that I found quite striking, and that term was atrocity propaganda, where you can either have the supposed footage of atrocities that never happened, but they flood the internet and everyone sees them, and most people assume they're real, and therefore the effect of those images is real, even if the atrocities themselves were not. Or you have some sort of atrocity that's committed, but then there is a disproportionately large effect because the imagery is just broadcast far and wide, you know? And so the messaging aspect is amplified, perhaps exponentially beyond the event itself, regardless of how terrible and tragic the event itself may have been, for sure. So my point here is the impact that a type of narrative is sold, which may or may not be true, may or may not even be real, but the narrative is sold and many people will buy that narrative. And a lot of times, if the narrative is accompanied with a show, it will have more impact. Now, what is the suspension of disbelief? So suspension of disbelief is what you do when you watch a movie. So when you watch a movie, you understand that you are watching the depiction of a story, a storyline, fictitious characters. Assuming that the movie is totally fictitious. I mean, there are some movies, of course, that are based on true stories, right? And you also realize that when you're watching it, but you understand the difference between a movie that is entirely fictitious, a movie that is based on a true story, where some of the elements may be true, some of the characters may be real, but some of the narrative, the gaps in the narrative have been filled in. There's been some artistic license. You kind of understand that as well. But you also understand that a documentary is much more grounded in truth, at least, ostensibly, right? You understand this when you're watching a movie or when you're reading a book. You understand when you read a book that a work of fiction is different than a work of nonfiction. So when you are engaging with a work of fiction, whether it's a movie, whether it's a book or whatever, you don't overly criticize the lack of realism unless the storytellers, those making the movies or the author that wrote the book, unless they ask you to kind of stretch your imagination too far, then it becomes a problem. But I'm going to read here just an article. This is from studiobinder.com. You could find plenty of other similar articles. There's nothing necessarily I mean, I just picked an article that I thought explained suspension of disbelief well. You could find the term explained other places too. But here's an article, and it's called "What is Suspension of Disbelief? How it Works in Storytelling." And I'm going to read just parts of this. Suspension of disbelief gives artists the liberty to create worlds in a realm separate from reality. But what is suspension of disbelief? Where did suspension of disbelief originate? Okay. Let's move on to the next paragraph. English poet and philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge is widely credited with introducing suspension of disbelief in his 1817 text Biographia Literaria. This suspension, also referred to as poetic faith, is meant to examine supernatural, and this is a quote from Coleridge, persons and characters, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, unquote. So Coleridge and colleague William Wordsworth espoused the philosophy of suspending disbelief in their writing. At some level, we must be able to recognize a story as something unbelievable, because the alternative is that we recognize a story as something just as real as our regular lives. Okay. We, just pausing for a moment, we understand the difference between a story that is not intended to be believed literally and one that is intended to be believed literally. So think of the example of a tall tale. So, we have these historical tall tales, many of which are folkloric in nature. I mean, think about Paul Bunyan, characters like that. But also a tall tale, so a tall tale is told often for entertainment value. It typically originates as an oral tale, could have been told historically around a campfire, but you may engage in tall tales with your friends. So think about, especially a group of guys that are hanging out. Think about the example where maybe dudes certainly do this. You're hanging out with a bunch of dudes and you're going to tell a story about something that happened. And you will particularly do this if one of your buddies is present who is involved in the story that you're about to tell, but there are other people that you're telling the story to that weren't there. So you're going to explain a story about something that happened in the past, and one of your buddies who is present for the telling of the story was present for what you're about to tell. So you're going to say, hey, one time, so-and-so and me, and then you go on to tell the story, but you may kind of exaggerate some of the elements of the story, particularly if you're kind of like poking fun at your buddy and what happened to him in the story. And you may exaggerate for comedic effect. And your buddies that are listening to the story that weren't there, they know you're exaggerating. Your buddy that was involved in the event that you're telling, of course, is going to be like, oh, no, that's not how it happened. And you're going to be like, yeah, that's exactly how it happened. And you're really just having a good time. So that's kind of an example, a contemporary way in which people still, tell tall tales all the time. Anyway, so that's kind of a tall tale. But my point is when you are telling these stories with your buddies also probably know that what you're telling is not 100% exactly what happened. It is your perspective with quite a bit of good-natured embellishment along with it. Okay. So again, we naturally understand the difference between stories that are told for entertainment value, stories that are told that are grounded in reality, but with plenty of embellishment, perhaps for entertainment value or comedic effect, and stories that are meant to be as close a depiction to reality as is possible, right? We kind of know the difference. So that is suspension of disbelief, when you know that you are engaging with a work of fiction. Now, I'm returning to this article here, and it says here, what is suspension of disbelief? Suspension of disbelief is the avoidance of logic in works of fiction, or the unreal filter through which connoisseurs of art choose to accept as part of the diegesis. Now, diegesis just means like expounding the story, the narrative of the fiction, which details what the characters are doing, thinking, etc. The tenets behind suspension of disbelief was commented on by Greek writers such as Aristotle and formally presented by poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1817. And we already read what he wrote. Okay. So there are certain ways in which this is done. We're not necessarily going to go into those, but suffice it to say here that we kind of understand that when you think about a movie, think about movies that they're fictitious movies. They're an action movie, just, to use that as an example. But they're action movies that are made to be as realistic as possible. And then there are action movies that are, there is an understanding between those that wrote the screenplay, the directors, and the audience. There's kind of this unspoken agreement that these characters and the action sequences are meant to be spectacular, to kind of use the word that I've been using tonight, right? They're meant to be overly fantastical, and you kind of understand that. I'll use the example of James Bond movies. So I like James Bond movies. They don't happen in like an other reality. I mean, these aren't fantasy pictures, like clearly there's a difference between watching a James Bond film and watching like the Lord of the Rings movies, which happen in like like a fantasy environment, like another world or whatever, So there's a whole completely different dimension of world building that happens there. In James Bond movies, that's not present, but you do understand like some of the action sequences are meant to be over the top. James Bond is not a very realistic figure. He's kind of he's an exaggerated caricature. If you understand that going in, then you can appreciate James Bond, the character, for what he is, and you can appreciate the movies for what they are, and you will enjoy the movie a lot more. You don't necessarily have to critique every single action sequence and say, that's not really realistic. You don't have to do that. But again, there's an acceptance on those who made the movie, whether it's the screenwriters or whether it's the directors. What are they asking me to accept, and what are they not? Like, where are they asking me to go too far? Okay, and there's an old term that's been around for decades now. It's called jumping the shark. So maybe you've heard that term, maybe you have not, but it actually relates to an old Happy Days episode. If you remember the old Happy Days sitcom, and when I was a kid, there were reruns that you could see all the time. I remember seeing reruns of the show when I was a kid. But there was an episode in which the character Fonzie, if you remember, I think his name was Arthur Fonzarelli. Everybody called him Fonzie, the Fonz. And in one of the episodes, he is water skiing and he jumps a shark. So that's where the term comes from. So over time, the term has come to mean, particularly like in this case, like in a TV show, where if a show has been very popular and a show has almost become a victim of its own popularity, and therefore the writers are having trouble coming up with new material, and then there may come a point, like a very discrete point, where they take things too far, where they're asking the viewer to just stretch too far with their imagination. And a lot of people point to that movie in Happy Days, and that's why they kind of use this term, jump the shark, and they refer to that point in that specific episode. Now, interestingly enough, you could say, hey, that term doesn't even necessarily apply to that specific point in that series, because even after that particular episode, Happy Days was still a very, very popular show for years to come. Anyway, so the term, though, again, implies that something is so ridiculous, so over the top, that the viewer has trouble suspending their disbelief. You're asking too much of the viewer. Okay, well, what does that have to do with what we are talking about here? There is a theatrical dimension to what is happening with these spectacles that we are being presented with, whether it is the wars. And I'm not saying everything is fake, but to a large degree, I do believe that they are planned from an overarching perspective that encompasses, both or all sides of these wars. And there is a narrative that in many cases is overly spectacular that accompanies these theatrics. And the people buy the narrative. They appreciate the show. And like I said in that X post, when people get wrapped up in the show, they want to be part of it. And they're not asking necessarily, well, what's the right thing to do? What's legal? What's moral? Or even what's true or what is real? Now, when you watch a movie, you willingly suspend your disbelief in order to enjoy the show. You maybe you've never heard the term suspension of disbelief before, but you know what I'm talking about. When I explain it, you are aware that you do that when you watch a movie. Like, you understand it. You know what it means to watch a movie. But what happens if you are watching what happens if you don't realize that you're watching a movie? What happens if then you don't realize that you have suspended your disbelief? So what if something is presented to you and it is overly spectacular, and therefore it triggers psychologically your suspension of disbelief mechanism without you necessarily realizing it? Okay? So here's what that would mean. That would mean that you are allowing yourself to believe certain things because you've suspended your disbelief without realizing that you've suspended your disbelief. It's almost like you're drunk and you have surrendered your judgment without realizing it. Okay? Because it's involuntary. So in that regard, it would be more like you've been drugged. It would be like you've been roofied. It would be like your judgment has been hijacked involuntarily. You may not even necessarily be aware. Or if you are aware, it is at such a subconscious level that you can't readily recognize with it. Now, if you think that's a stretch, hold on a second. I'm going to read you another X post that I made. This was actually from a couple years ago. And it was in response to something that I thought was very peculiar when I saw it. So on Christmas Eve of 2023, there was a weird 7-minute interview that was put out there by Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson, in this interview that was only a couple of minutes long, he is speaking with not Kevin Spacey, and it's important that you understand this distinction, but with Frank Underwood, which was the character played by Kevin Spacey in the show House of Cards. And a lot of people watched this. It was presented on X, or, Twitter in those days, I guess, right? And people thought, what is this? This is bizarre. And people thought that for a variety of reasons. One, a lot of people don't necessarily like Kevin Spacey because of some of the allegations over the years towards him or whatever. And, there are people that question Tucker Carlson. I myself have had questions about Tucker Carlson, and I say that as someone who has been interviewed by Tucker Carlson. So I think there are good things that Tucker Carlson has put out there. I think that there are truths that he has put out there. I think there are good people that he has interviewed. I don't necessarily know what his motives are. At times I've questioned those. I'm not sure to what extent he's been used wittingly or unwittingly. I don't necessarily know, but I do have questions. But he interviewed me and gave me an opportunity to share some things about, the military and the COVID shot mandates. And I was appreciative of the opportunity to share some truth, which is why I took him up on it. Interestingly enough, that invite for me to be interviewed by him was literally just weeks after this little interview that he released on, like I said, on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2023. So on the day that it was released, I reposted it and I had this to say about the interview. Okay. And I'm going to read my post. And then I would encourage you, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I will link my X post in the description. And so you will see the repost and you'll be able to go and watch the actual interview to know what I'm talking about. It's only 7 minutes long. If you have not watched it, you should go watch it, not just for the necessary background context as to what I'm talking about in my post, but just also you can draw your own conclusions about what you think Tucker and Frank Underwood are talking about here. But here's what I wrote about this interview. We have to understand what's going on here. Look closely at what is happening. Whether this is real or AI is largely irrelevant. Because people, and I'm saying that because people were saying that this whole interview is AI. And what I'm saying is whether it is or isn't, it doesn't matter. So I go on to say the conversation itself, even if completely done by AI, is still real. Listen to what is being said about the blend between true and false, life and art, reality and performance. Now I'm going to read that again because that is super important. Listen to what is being said about the blend between true and false, life and art, reality and performance. Those three, those three couplets are really important in my mind. All right, I go on to say, there is a real world person, Tucker, speaking with a fictional character, Frank Underwood, and yet clear allusions are made to Spacey's life. Is Tucker speaking to Underwood or Spacey or both? So much of what is presented to us as real is theater. They blur the lines on purpose to control what we're supposed to believe. This is worldview warfare. We are in a deep war. Listen to what they're clearly telling you. That's my initial take on this. Now, what I was referring to is Tucker was asking questions to Spacey in the character of Frank Underwood, and it's Frank Underwood that talks about this blend between true and false, life and art, reality and performance. And I thought, when I watched this 2.5 years ago, I remember thinking, this is incredibly revealing. You know, that was my initial thought. I still think this to this day. So here's what I'm driving at. Understand why we are being presented with the spectacle, and that beneath the grand spectacle, there are things going on that people may not be aware of or sufficiently concerned with. What are the questions not being asked? You get wrapped up in the spectacle and you're no longer concerned with what's right, what's moral, what's ethical, what's legal, what's true, what's real. We can't confuse the spectacle with reality. We can't permit the intentional blend between what's real and unreal to become more blurred than it already is. Truth is truth. Reality is reality. We are entering territory in which we risk becoming epistemologically unmoored. Okay, what do I mean by epistemologically unmoored? I mean that we are risking becoming no longer anchored or grounded in truth and reality, or where it becomes harder and harder to anchor our beliefs to truth and reality. And I think that that is where they want us. This is worldview warfare. You know, like I've been saying for several years now, there's an epistemological component to worldview warfare. It's not just what you believe. It's how you arrive at those beliefs and then deconstructing, again, not just your beliefs, but also your ability to arrive at those beliefs. Disbelief in many ways is just as important as belief. It's important that you believe what is true and what is real. But it is also very important that you recognize untruth, that you recognize falsehood, that you recognize what is not real. Therefore, you can avoid it, you can eschew it, you can evade it, you can disbelieve it. That's also important. Life is given to us by God the Creator. It is not some artificial construction of those in power who want to keep us ungrounded from truth, unanchored from reality. Remember that. It's important, and I'll see you next time.